Welcome to the podcast, This But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction about the Middle Ages. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels, and today we're going to answer the question, what is a crusade? My co-host for this episode is my partner for life and my inspiration for all things medieval, my wife, Ellen.
Richard and I have done a couple of episodes dealing with the Crusades. One was on Saladin's capture of Jerusalem in 1187, and another was on the assassination of the King of Jerusalem-elect, Conrad of Montferrat.
By real assassins. To be honest, those are two of my favorite episodes.
And Richard's last episode was a conversation with Nick Morton about crusading warfare. If you haven't listened to them, I hope you do. But you might want to wait until after listening to this one, which we ought to have done first. It struck us that Nick was talking less about what I thought of as crusading warfare. That is, the armies and campaigns of the First Crusade, and those of the other numbered crusades that traveled from Western Europe to the Middle East for the Christian recovery of or in defense of the Holy Land, than it was about the warfare practiced by the Latin states created in the wake of the First Crusade. So I asked Richard what I thought would be an easily answered question. Were the military expeditions of these Latin states crusades? And were the European settlers in them crusaders? And that raised a broader question. When historians write about the Crusades, what exactly do they mean by crusade?
And it hit me that I should have asked Nick those questions. Because I didn't, I will try to answer them myself. And the answers are not as clear as one might expect. I'm going to begin with a couple of non-historians who clearly believed that they knew exactly what a crusade was because one of them was fighting a crusade and the other resisting it. Probably the only thing that President George W. Bush and Osama bin Laden ever agreed on was that the American War on Terror was a crusade. On September 16, 2001, President Bush gave a press conference on the White House lawn. In his prepared remarks, he praised and reassured the American people, saying, quote, "And on this day on the Lord's Day, I say to my fellow Americans, thank you for your prayers, thank you for your compassion, thank you for your love for one another. And tomorrow, when you get back to work hard like you always have. But we've been warned. There are evil people in this world. We've been warned so vividly and we'll be alert. Your government is alert. The governors and mayors are alert that evil folk still lurk out there." End quote. Then in response to a reporter's question, Bush said the following.
"We haven't seen this kind of barbarism in a long period of time. And this is a new kind of evil. And we understand, and the American people are beginning to understand. Now, this crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while."
It seems pretty clear to me that Bush described the war on terror as a crusade because he saw it as a righteous struggle against evildoers, not a religious expression.
Yeah, that was in fact the explanation given by the White House press secretary, Ari Fleischer.
He used the word once in passing and it required an explanation from the press secretary?
Yeah, it did. Because Bush's characterization of the war on terror as a crusade created a stir both in Europe and the Middle East. At a press briefing 2 days later, Fleischer was asked to explain what President Bush meant when he used the word crusade. Given the consternation it created, quote, in a lot of Muslim countries, end quote, the reporter continued, "Did the president now regret having used that word?" "I think what the president was saying," Fleischer responded, "had no intended consequences for anybody, Muslim or otherwise, other than to say that this is a broad cause that he is calling on America and the nations around the world to join." That was the purpose of what he said. To the degree that the word has any connotations that would upset any of our partners or anybody else in the world, the president would regret if anything like that was conveyed. But the purpose of his conveying it is in the traditional English sense of the word. It's broad.
Kind of ironic, given the history of the Crusades, that a Jewish press secretary had to defend the use of the word crusade.
Yeah, it is. But I wonder if Ari Fleischer was conscious of the irony.
At any rate, you said that this is one thing that Bush and bin Laden agreed on. So what did bin Laden mean by crusade? And I assume it wasn't just a war against evildoers.
No. Osama bin Laden leaped on Bush's remarks to condemn any Muslim leader who offered support to what he characterized as this new Christian crusade against Islam. He declared, and I quote, "Our goal is for our nation to unite in the face of the Christian crusade. This is the fiercest battle. Muslims have never faced anything bigger than this." Bush said it in his own words, crusade. When Bush says that, they try to cover up for him. They say that he said he didn't mean it, but he did say crusade. Bush is the leader. He carries the big cross and walks. I swear that everyone who follows Bush and his scheme have given up Islam and the word of the Prophet. Those who follow Bush in his crusade against Muslims have denounced Allah. This is a recurring war. The original crusade brought Richard from Britain, Louis from France, and Barbarous from Germany, by which he meant Frederick Barbarossa. Today, the crusading countries rushed as soon as Bush raised the cross. They accepted the rule of the cross. What do Arab countries have to do with this crusade? Everyone that supports Bush, even with a word, is an act of great treason.
Well, at least Osama bin Laden seems to have known something about the Crusades. And how did President Bush respond?
He didn't. At least he didn't in public. He just dropped the word crusade from his speeches and comments to reporters. I suspect that Bush was surprised and confused by the controversy. By using the word crusade, he meant to convey that the war on terror was a selfless struggle against evil. This is what Dwight D. Eisenhower meant when he entitled his wartime memoirs Crusade in Europe. It's also what the British Prime Minister Lloyd George meant when he entitled a collection of speeches he had given during the First World War, The Great Crusade. And Ari Fleischer was right in saying that the word has, or at least had, before we got involved in a series of wars in the Islamic Middle East, a broad meaning in the U.S. It's been used as a metaphor for movements against various social ills. We've had crusades against poverty, crusades against illiteracy, crusades against alcohol, and crusades against drugs. Crusade has been used as a label for spiritual revival movements, most notably Billy Graham's Evangelical Campus Crusade, which preserves the word's religious, if not military, connotations.
But it is clear that crusade meant something very different to Osama bin Laden. It sounds like he used Bush's statement as a call to arms to all Muslims to resist against what he saw as continuing religious and cultural imperialist aggression of the Christian West against the Islamic East, as part of a centuries-old clash of cultures and religions. But I agree with you. I don't think Bush meant that when he called the war on terror a crusade, despite the religious rhetoric and evangelical tone of his prepared comments. I'm going to guess that you think that bin Laden was closer to what medieval historians mean by crusade than Bush.
No, you guess wrong.
Gang.
Unless the medieval historians you have in mind are 19th century Frenchmen like Francois Michaud.
Okay.
Though they wouldn't have used the term aggression, but has celebrated the crusade as the triumph of a superior civilization, the French civilization.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. For historians of the Middle Ages in America and Europe, neither Bush nor Osama got it right in their usage of the word crusade. That what they called a crusade has very little to do with crusading as a historical movement.
Why are you limiting this to American and European academics?
Good, you caught that.
You can't slip anything by me. We've been married too long.
Actually, I was counting on you to catch it. You could have added German and Italian historians of the Crusades to that list. In fact, all Western academic historians of the Crusades. Modern Islamic historiography of the Crusades, however, is a lot different, though it also has a Western pedigree. Bin Laden was drawing upon the thought of 19th century French nationalist historians indirectly. The idea that the Crusades were the beginning of European imperial aggression against the Muslim world became the dominant theme in modern Arabic historians' interpretation of the Crusades.
I'm not a big fan of historiography, but I have to ask, Why did modern Arabic historians need to use 19th century French historians' interpretations of the Crusades? Why didn't they use the medieval Arab historians' works? After all, we do have contemporary accounts of the Crusades.
Yeah, especially for the Third Crusade because of the contemporary prominence of Saladin. The works of Arab historians like Ibn al-Athir, Ibad al-Din, and Beha al-Din are critical sources for the Third Crusade and for Saladin's career in general. But as odd as it sounds, after the fall of Acre in 1291, the Crusades pretty much disappeared from the writings of Muslim historians. That is, until 1899.
Okay, you need to explain that. I would have thought that the Crusades would have been celebrated by Muslim historians. After all, they won.
Yeah, exactly. They won. And because they won, it wasn't a problem for Muslim historians. It was for the Muslim world a historical blip. The Crusader states at their height formed only a narrow strip along the Levantine coast. While Western historians, both Catholic and Protestants, regarded the Crusades as a critical historical event for different reasons, historians in the Muslim world didn't. That is, until the very end of the 19th century.
I suspect I know what changed. The once powerful Islamic Ottoman Empire had become the sick man of Europe. And instead of being an empire, it was being targeted by European imperialists.
Exactly. The first modern Muslim account of the Crusades was entitled Splendid Accounts in the Wars of the Cross by the Egyptian historian Sayyid Ali al-Hariri. Al-Hariri began it by quoting the Ottoman Sultan's remark that, quote, Europe is now carrying out a crusade against us in the form of a political campaign, end quote. Al-Hariri accepted what the 19th century nationalist French historians had written about the Crusades. They were Western imperialistic wars against the Islamic world. An Arabic history of the Crusades was timely because European imperialist powers were reviving the Crusades against the Ottoman Empire. But it really wasn't until 1948 that the Crusades became an important theme in Muslim historiography.
1948, let me guess, the foundation of Israel.
Exactly. Israel was denounced as the new Crusader state.
That's perverse. Israel was founded as a Jewish state, and the Jews of the Rhineland were the first victims of the First Crusade.
Yes, but by labeling Israel a Crusader state, what they meant was that it was an imperialist European colony established on Arab territory.
Which is a current trope of people who don't want to know any better.
Okay.
I know.
Your position is clear on this.
Don't hold back. Tell me what you really think. Yeah.
Yeah. What made the comparison inevitable is the location of Israel. That it was a Jewish state was downplayed. Yeah, it was downplayed in 1948 and was downplayed in the following decades because in those decades, religion was eclipsed by Arab nationalism in Arabic accounts of the Crusades. A cinematic example of this is the 1963 Egyptian epic Al-Nasir Salah al-Din, which was released in Britain and the U.S. as Saladin the Victorious.
You mean Nasser means victorious?
Yeah.
Why am I not surprised? Okay.
In the movie, Saladin's call for Arab unity closely echoes Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's pan-Arabism. Saladin's religious tolerance is also emphasized, as is the religious hypocrisy of the evil rulers of the Crusader states. Saladin's best friend and advisor in the movie is, in fact, a very fictional Christian Arab.
Yet another movie I've missed and have no intention of seeing. But Osama bin Laden's speech is not about pan-Arabism. It's about religion.
Yes. And that's the contribution of late 20th and early 21st century Islamist writers about the Crusades. They restored the religious element to it. They combined the 19th century French nationalist idea of the Crusades as European colonialism, European imperialism, with the idea of the Crusades as part of a continuing religious struggle between Islam and its enemies, now expanded to include the Jews.
Okay, so I'll bite. How do American and European academic historians define the term crusade as an historical movement?
There is an agreement about that.
What a surprise. I assumed they agreed that it was a Christian holy war.
Yeah, but they disagree about where and when they occurred and what precisely constituted a crusade.
Okay, could you explain that?
There are currently 4 main schools of historical thought about crusades. The 2 that currently dominate the field are the Traditionalists and the Pluralists. The other 2, the Popularist and Generalist schools, have attracted fewer historians but have their fervent adherents. So let me briefly explain each before giving my own opinion of what a crusade was during the Middle Ages. The Traditionalist definition is probably the most familiar. For traditionalists, the Crusades were a series of Christian holy wars called by medieval popes to recover or preserve Jerusalem and the Holy Land for Christians.
Well, that's pretty much what I learned about Crusades as an undergraduate, and I would think that it's what most of our listeners probably think of when they hear the word.
This was the dominant view into the 1970s.
When we were in college.
Yeah. It's why only Crusades to the east get numbers. For traditionalists, the Crusades occurred in a particular geographical region, the Levant and Egypt, and had a clearly defined beginning, the Council of Clermont in 1095, and a clearly defined end, the fall of the last Latin stronghold in the Levant Acre, now in northern Israel, in 1291.
But that's only one school. I hesitate to ask about, okay, what are the others?
For the Popularists, to be a crusade, a military expedition had to be characterized by genuine popular religious excitement, prophecy, and apocalyptic expectations. Popularists emphasize the participation of the lower classes, the peasants, and urban workers. For some popularists, the only real crusades, the only true crusades, were the People's Crusade of 1096, the 2 Shepherds' Crusades, and the Children's Crusades.
In other words, 3 slaughters. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, that is true. The popularist approach has attracted fewer historians than either the Traditionalists or the Pluralists.
Okay, so it sounds like the popularist definition is the most restrictive. I mean, it's only 3, which didn't matter very much in the long run. So is the generalist the most expansive?
You are absolutely right. Generalists give the label crusade to any Christian holy war inspired by the belief that God wills it.
Okay, it sounds like I'm listening to the historian's version of Goldilocks. The traditionalist and popularist definitions are too narrow. The generalist is too broad. Is the pluralist?
Yeah, it's just right. At least it's just right for most English language historians writing today. For pluralists, the Crusades were a series of Christian, and this is important, penitential holy wars called by or sanctioned by the popes and directed against external and internal enemies of Christendom, that is, enemies of the Roman Catholic Church, for the recovery of Christian territory or in defense of the church or the Christian people. Crusades combined the ideas of Christian holy war and pilgrimage to produce the concept of penitential warfare.
Okay, can you define penitential warfare?
Yeah, that is warfare in which the Pope granted remission of penance for and forgiveness of sin to those who voluntarily participated in them. For pluralists, crusades were characterized by the taking of vows and the granting of indulgences and secular privileges, such as protection of property from lawsuits or from physical attacks, and a debt holiday. The defining grant, however, was the indulgence, and that was given because participation in this arduous and dangerous endeavor was regarded as a penitential act sufficient to compensate for the penalties incurred from all previous sins.
Well, that just sounds like the traditionalist definition.
The 2 share this broad understanding what a crusade was. They differ, however, when it comes where and when crusades occurred. The pluralists find the traditionalist and populist definition of crusades too narrow, as they exclude crusading in the West and most crusading after 1291.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, not that I thought about it, but when we did episodes about the crusade against the Cathar heresy in southern France, and an English crusade against Magna Carta barons and their French allies, we were using the pluralist definition of crusading. But what doesn't make much sense to me is how academic historians who have devoted years of their lives to the study of crusading disagree on something as fundamental as what it was.
We've done the stuff on feudalism, haven't we? Go ahead.
Yeah. Isn't the academic historian's usual solution to a problem like this to go to the primary sources and analyze what the authors of those texts meant? I mean, how about when they use the word crusades?
And that's the problem. Historians will tell you there is no specific, widely accepted 12th or 13th century word for a crusade.
You're phrasing that really careful, like you're walking through a minefield.
I am, and I did. An early 13th century Occitan epic poem about the then ongoing Albigensian crusade, the crusade against the Cathars, is entitled Canso della Crusada, Song of the Crusade. The poem terms crusaders as the Crusat. The word Crusata probably refers to the northern French army rather than the expedition. The term, however, didn't catch on. Our word crusade and its slightly earlier French counterpart, croisade, are early modern concoctions. The French word croisade first appears in the title of a history of the Crusades, published in 1638, and the English word crusade appears for the first time in 1685 in a translation of a French history of the Crusades, which had been published 10 years earlier. It wasn't until the mid-18th century that crusade, croisade, and the German word Kreuzzüge were widely used in English, French, and German historical writing.
Oh, good Lord. We're back to the feudalism problem?
And the Cathar problem.
Oh, good Lord.
Just because a word or label is commonly used by historians today to describe historical events or movements doesn't necessarily mean that those terms were actually used in the Middle Ages.
Okay. If the sources for crusading didn't use the word crusade to describe these expeditions, what did they call them?
The terms that were used in 12th and 13th century sources to describe the activity that we call crusading, I think, can help us understand what those who called for these expeditions and those who responded to those calls thought they were doing. Crusaders saw themselves as undertaking a peregrinatio, a pilgrimage, or they were going on an etor, or a via, a journey, or more rarely, they were going on an expeditio, an expedition, and thought of the enterprise in which they were engaged as the business of Christ. Until the end of the 12th centuries, those who went on crusade were most commonly termed as peregrini, pilgrims, in the charters, recording their preparations to go on crusade. In the narrative sources, laymen in the crusading armies were designated as milites Dei or milites Christi, knights or soldiers of God or Christ, and the rank and file as paupres, which carried the double meaning of the economically poor and the poor in spirit.
Okay, that doesn't explain how we ended up with the word crusade, since obviously it derives from the French word for the cross. How did the cross come to stand for crusading?
From the beginning of crusading, there was a technical term used by ecclesiastical authorities to designate those who had taken an oath to go on crusade. These individuals were said to have been cruce signati, that is, signed with the cross. By the end of the 12th century, it had become the standard term for designating one who had taken a crusading vow. I believe that this phrase, signed with the cross, is the key to understanding and defining crusade, as well as being its etymological source. The word crusade, which is derived from crosada, an Occitan word coined in the early 13th century, is a collective noun for those who took or carried the cross, not a description of the activity or the expedition.
Why signed by the cross?
These are literal thinkers, and this is a literal description.
At a time when a lot of people are illiterate?
Yes, okay. Literal description of those who undertook crusading vows. When Pope Urban II called for the Knights of Western Europe to embark upon an armed pilgrimage to liberate Jerusalem in 1095, he directed those who answered his call to affirm their intention with a solemn vow. They were instructed to attach a cloth cross, a piece of cloth with a cross drawn on it, to their outer garments while pronouncing their promise aloud. By taking the cross, by being cruce signatus, signed with the cross, they became what we call a crusader. This practice was standard throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. As I said, being signed by the cross created a complex of spiritual and legal privileges, but the most important of these was the remission of penance for all sins previously committed that were confessed with true contrition, and protection of one's property from legal or extra-legal attacks in the Crusaders' absence. The oath created an obligation to God that remained until it was fulfilled. There may not have been a widely used word for crusade during the Crusades, but there was one for crusader.
Okay. So I'm trying to think what it would have meant for someone to sew a cross on his or her clothing. I mean, literally, was it taking up Christ's cross?
It was. The cloth cross conveyed a dual meaning. On the one hand, it symbolized Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre, the destination of those who went on the First Crusade. But it also had the broader connotation of serving the Lord Christ and enduring hardship carrying Christ's cross. It announced the oath-taker's willingness to accept martyrdom. The onerous and dangerous service to God represented by the cross was the penance that merited the Crusaders' plenary indulgence. The cross had a special meaning in the Crusades to the Muslim East and the so-called Spanish Reconquista. For the Muslims, the cross was in fact the symbol of the Christians' fundamental theological error. Christ, the Muslim Messiah, and this is according to Muslim theology, Christ did not die on the cross.
This is like 12th century Muslim theology.
Continues today.
Okay.
God would never have allowed such an injustice. God instead fashioned a phantom to take his place on the cross and took him directly to heaven. Christ will return in the final days to lead the armies of God against the infidel, including those who claim the name Christian. From the 12th century on, Muslim poets praised Turkish war leaders, those who wage jihad against crusaders, and the leaders of the Latin states as breakers of the cross. The Spanish Muslim geographer and travel writer Ibn Jabir eulogized Saladin with the following words, quote, "You have broken their cross by force, and what a fine breaker you are. Their kingdom has retreated in Syria and has turned its back as if it had never been. You have avenged the religion. God has chosen you as an avenger." End quote.
By emphasizing the Crusader vow, symbolized by sewing the cross onto one's clothes, you seem to be de-emphasizing Jerusalem and the biblical Holy Land in your definition of crusade.
To an extent. What seems to be crucial is that the same oaths were taken and the same privileges promised to those who answered papal summons to defend Christianity and the Church against Turks in the East, Saracens in Spain, pagans in the Baltic, heretics wherever they lurked, whether in southwest France or Bohemia, enemies of the papacy in Sicily and Italy, Mongols, French invaders and rebel barons in England, and Ottoman Turks in the Balkans. Those signed with the cross engaged the enemies of God and the Church wherever the papacy directed. But Jerusalem held a special place in crusading ideology, both as a physical place and as a spiritual idea, and the First Crusade served as a model for all subsequent crusading.
That's a lot broader definition than the traditionalist view we grew up with. How does that alter the dating of the Crusader movement?
By this definition, the Spanish Armada against the quote-unquote heretics of Protestant England in 1588 was a crusade.
That's an awful long way from Jerusalem and centuries after the First Crusade.
Yeah, it is. But it also seems clear that Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre held that special place for crusading. The First Crusade remained the model for all later expeditions wherever they went.
So are you in the pluralist camp?
Yeah, I think you could gather that from what I've said, right? Yeah. Scholars in the Middle Ages always cited authority to substantiate their views, and I'm going to emulate them. I'm going to do that because I'm not by training a crusading specialist. The pluralist definition of crusading was popularized among academics by Professor Jonathan Riley Smith. Riley Smith, who taught at St. Andrews, then at Royal Holloway College of the University of London, and at both Queen's College and Emmanuel College at the University of Cambridge, was arguably the most influential historian of the Crusades of the second half of the 20th century, both through his publications and through the work of his many students. Riley Smith's work persuades me that the pluralist school comes closest to how medieval people actually understood crusading. The popes who called for crusades and those who took the cross, I believe, understood these expeditions as penitential Christian holy wars, regardless of where they were sent.
So you see crusading as a particular type of Christian holy war?
Yes. But what I find interesting is that medieval theologians regarded crusades as a species of Christian just war. Nick in the previous episode said that he was first attracted to study the Crusades because of the theological question, how does a religion that mandates love of one's enemies and beating swords into plowshares end up with the Crusades?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is. It's a complicated historical question, and it really deserves its own episode, which I think maybe we'll do. But we need to touch on it here. When Christianity was adopted in the 4th century as the imperial religion of the Roman Empire, it had to temper its pacifistic teachings. The Christian Roman Empire needed to defend itself with Christian soldiers. The solution was given by St. Jerome and most fully by St. Augustine around the year 400. This solution was Christian just war. Christian just war was an adaptation of Roman just war theory as expounded by writers like Cicero. The pagan Romans believed that because the gods are just, they would only favor those fighting for justice.
If only it were that easy.
The criteria for a just war offered by Cicero became the basis for Augustine's conception of just war. And that was systemized in the 13th century by medieval canonists and theologians such as St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, for a war to be just, 3 things are necessary. 1, just authority.
Okay.
It must be waged by the leader of a state, since all legitimate earthly authority comes from God. And you can see this from Romans 13, verses 1 to 4.
And the distinction drawn there is?
Between private wars by nobles, these feuds and rebellions, and just war, which are led by kings, those with legitimate authority.
So that, by definition, okay,
a rebellion can't be just.
Rebels are unjust, okay.
By just, which is the reason why.
Regius Caesar,
yeah,
okay.
And the Magna Carta rebels were condemned by the papacy.
Okay, that makes sense.
The second criterion was just cause. They must be fought for the sake of, quote, avenging wrongs, when a nation or state has to be punished for refusing to make amends for the wrongs inflicted by its subjects or to restore what it has seized unjustly, end quote.
If they actually followed that, Rome would never have had an empire, but never mind.
The Romans claimed that they were always protecting their allies against the aggression of the enemies. Rome claimed it never fought an unjust war.
Okay, never mind.
3, rightful intention. To advance good and to avoid evil. That is, to secure peace, punish evildoers, sounds like Bush, and defend the good, as opposed to the desire to increase territory or to increase power or just out of a cruel thirst for vengeance. The prince is responsible to God for ensuring that the cause of war is just. The soldier's Christian duty is to fight with love in his heart for the enemy. That's how you square the circle. Love the sinner, but hate the sin.
Is that like in the Inquisition, where if you had to execute somebody, if you had to release somebody of the secular arm, you felt you had failed?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Augustine believed that the true evil of warfare was not the death that resulted from it, but it was the hatred, the militia, that it stirred up in the hearts of those who fought.
I can sort of see how this is going. The Crusades were Christian just wars because they were called by a just authority, the Pope,
Yep.
had a just cause, fought against external or internal enemies for the recovery of Christian property or defense of the church or the Christian people, and were, at least theoretically, fought with rightful intention.
Exactly. The idea of just cause underlay the distinction drawn by popes and theologians, such as St. Bernard of Clairvaux, between Jews and Muslims living within Christendom who should, and I have to emphasize this, should not be attacked. And Turks...
that makes sense.
Yeah.
The Inquisition had no jurisdiction over anybody who wasn't Christian.
Yeah.
At least theoretically.
And these guys are not attacking Christian property. They're not taking anything from the Christians. They're simply living in peace among them. And Turks in Palestine, Saracens in Spain, pagan Slavs in the Baltic, or heretics in southern France who are attacking Christianity and the church and should be attacked. The latter were legitimate objects of warfare because they held Christian lands and or oppressed Christians. Even then, war should be a last resort. As St. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote in a treatise on the new order of the Templars, quote, I do not mean to say that pagans are to be slaughtered when there is any other way to prevent them from harassing and persecuting the faithful, end quote.
But as you said earlier, Crusades were not simply just wars. They were Christian holy wars. How did that affect, if at all, Augustinian just war theory?
The idea of crusade added two further assumptions to Augustinian just war theory. One, violence and its consequences, that is, death and injury, are morally neutral rather than intrinsically evil.
Yikes.
Whether violence is good or bad is a matter of intention. The analogy given in our sources is to a surgeon who cuts into the body, thus injuring it in order to make it healthier. Before 1095, a soldier who killed in war, even a just war, had committed a sin that required him to do penance. Okay, the second is that Christ is concerned with the political order of man and intends for his agents on earth, kings, popes, bishops, to establish on earth a Christian republic that is a, quote, single universal transcendental state, end quote, ruled by Christ through the lay and clerical magistrates he endowed with authority. It follows from this that the defense of the Christian Republic against God's enemies, whether foreign infidel, for example, the Turks, or domestic heretics, is a moral imperative for those qualified to fight.
Gewalt. To be clear, the idea of Christian holy war wasn't just invented by Pope Urban II and the Council of Clermont. I mean, didn't Charlemagne present his wars against the pagan Avars and Slavs in the late 8th century as holy wars?
Yeah, he did.
And I've read that the wars fought by Byzantium against the Arab Islamic expansion of the 8th and 9th centuries were considered to be holy wars.
Yeah. The Byzantine emperors always portrayed all of their wars as Christian holy wars. And, Christian writers had a biblical model for holy war, and that's the conquest of the Holy Land by the Hebrews in the Old Testament. And that was unsurprisingly cited repeatedly by medieval chroniclers of the Crusades, as well as illustrated in the illuminated manuscripts of crusading Bibles, like the early 13th century Picture Bible, now housed in the Morgan Library in New York City.
So the Morgan Picture Bible is a crusading Bible?
It's a crusading Bible.
That would explain a lot. Okay, but crusading wasn't the only type of Christian holy war, was it? I mean, the Protestants saw themselves as fighting holy wars against the Catholics, too. I mean, from what you've said, the real distinction of crusades was the penitential part.
Exactly. Okay. That's my point. Pope Urban II and his successors offered to those who fought plenary indulgences for their sins. Taking and fulfilling the crusading vow served in place of penance for all sins the crusader had committed, and it's crucial to understand the sin had to be confessed with true contrition. The theory behind penance, and this may be obvious to the Catholics in our audience, but not obvious to everyone, the theory behind penance is that God will forgive truly confessed sins, but that the commission of a sin deforms the world and requires compensation. Hence, it requires penance.
I don't remember that, but then again, that was what?
That's why you say Hail Marys and all that type of stuff. That's penance.
Okay.
It is no coincidence that the idea of crusading arose at the same time that the Catholic Church was sharpening its definition of the sacrament of reconciliation. Nor is it coincidence that the word most often used to describe a crusade in the first century of crusading is pilgrimage, which was the penance par excellence. And it's also, you have to think about this, the argument that Ansel made explaining why God deigned to become incarnate, to become a human, was because the sins of man, the original sin of Adam, had to be compensated. And the only compensation that could be given is not by a sinful man, but by a man without sin. The crucifixion was the penance that God himself paid in order for man to be forgiven by God.
Okay. Is it the penitential aspect of crusading, then, that makes it unique from other religious or politically motivated warfare?
I would say it is what distinguishes it from other forms of Christian holy war. It represents a revolution in Western Christian thought about war and sin. Before the Council of Clermont in 1095 and the First Crusade, all killing required penance because the act itself was considered to be sinful. And that was true even if the killing was in a just cause. The Normans who fought at Hastings fought under a papal banner, but a year later they were forced to do penance for those they had killed in battle.
Who forced them?
A church council.
Okay.
Bishops forced them.
Okay.
Killing the obstinate enemies of God and his church was not even morally neutral now. It was spiritually meritorious.
But that doesn't answer Nick's original question. How could this be reconciled with a religion that preached love of one's enemies?
Christianity also preaches love of one's neighbors and love of the Lord God. The penitential merit of crusading did not stem from the killing. It was from the love that the crusader showed for his fellow Christians by his willingness to expose himself to danger and to risk death to free them from the oppression of the enemies of God. It was the willingness to suffer to recover that which rightfully belongs to Christ. Remember what I said at the beginning of the podcast? When someone took a crusading oath, he or she, and yes, there were female crusaders, sewed onto his or her clothing a patch with the sign of the cross. The cross was a multivalent symbol. In the First Crusade, it called to mind the object, the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. But it also recalled Christ's passion. By going on crusade and risking his life in obedience to and in the service of Christ, the knight was practicing what in the Middle Ages was called imitatio Christi, imitation of Christ. Prior to this, the imitatio Christi required a knight to abandon his profession of arms, to enter a monastery, or to become a religious hermit. Crusades allowed the knight to do so and remain a knight.
Did the church actually recognize those who died on crusade as martyrs?
Not formally. The church defined a martyr as one who accepts death without resistance for the faith. In contrast, a crusader's death was the death of a warrior. Crusaders themselves, however, saw the fallen as martyrs and venerated themselves as such. And clerics who preached the crusade, I think, purposely blurred the distinction. Crusading offered knights forgiveness of many sins that the noble lifestyle they followed made unavoidable. Service to the Lord God without abandoning their station as knights was another reason to go on crusade. The crusades were a cause worth fighting and dying in, and the promise of heaven for those who did die while wearing the cross was probably the greatest of all of the attractions of crusading. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was without a doubt the most effective recruiter for the disastrous Second Crusade, pushed all the right buttons in his sermon at the Council of Vézelay in 1146, and I quote, "Christian warriors, he who gave his life for you demands yours in return. These are combats worthy of you, combats in which it is glorious to conquer and advantageous to die. Illustrious knights, generous defenders of the cross, remember the example of your fathers who conquered Jerusalem and whose names are inscribed in heaven. Abandon then the things that perish to gather unfading palms and conquer a kingdom that has no end, end quote.
Wow.
And I think that sums up nicely the ideal of crusading for the aristocracy in the 12th century.
As usual, we've run out of time, but one last question. Do you think that the leaders and settlers of the Latin states of the Levant were crusaders? Or how about the mercenaries that Nick Morton said played so prominent a role in the armies of the Crusader states?
Okay. Many of those who settled in Outremer originally came as crusaders, and they had taken the crusading vow. But once they had settled there, they had fulfilled that vow, and I don't think they were crusaders anymore.
Does that mean that any sins they created once they became landowners in the crusading kingdom were no longer forgiven?
Nope. No, you see, the thing about it is,
so speak as a lawyer, you got to read the small print.
You got to read the small. It's not forgiveness of sins you're going to commit. This is like confession. You can't enter the confessional and say to the priest, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been a week since my last confession. I have sinned most grievously by having sex with a married lady. I am sorry for this sin with all my heart. I deserve whatever penance you see fit. But could it cover also my actions for next Saturday as well, since I have another date with her?"
Only all the sins that you committed at the time that you took the cross.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So once you settled there, you're no longer a crusader, although you've now settled in the Holy Land.
Okay, gotcha.
Okay. And in the decades following the establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, many migrants came who hadn't taken the cross. The newly, quote-unquote, liberated coastal cities of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch cried out for French tradesmen and craftsmen. The lure of walking in the footsteps of Christ and his apostles undoubtedly had an appeal, but so did the prospect of economic advancement, and the two were not exclusive. What made someone a crusader was not that he lived in the Holy Land, but that he or she was signed by the cross.
Okay.
So, if you're pressing me,
yes,
my answer is no.
Okay.
The military activities of the Latin states of the Levant may have been Christian holy wars, and I have no doubt that that's exactly how King Guy of Lusignan and the great army of 20,000 that he assembled at La Soufrière near Nazareth to counter Saladin's invasion, that's what they thought they were doing. They thought they were engaged in holy war. That army, after all, marched into the desert under the banner of the true cross, carrying the true cross. But as I said, not all Christian holy wars were crusades, and not all those who fought on crusade were, at least formally, crusaders.
I'm not sure that Nicholas Morton would agree with you about that, but that will have to be the last word for today.
I plan to have Nick back to talk about the Hattin campaign, and I'll ask him then.
All right.
But that's it for today. I hope that you'll be able to join us for our next episode, which, if everything goes as planned, will be on St. Thomas Becket, and will be with my friend and veteran of this podcast, Dr. Jennifer Paxton. But bye for now.
Bye.